When it comes to making your own seed starting mix or potting mix, you're going to want to watch this video because there's one ingredient that makes up all seed starting mixes and potting mixes that is critical. But if you get the amount wrong, it can behave in a way that can either cost you money or even kill your plants. Let's go. So every single seed starting mix or potting mix that you buy, you're going to have three main ingredients. The first one is your bulk. That's actually what makes up the majority of your seed starting mix or potting mix, and that's generally either coconut husk fiber or peat moss. Now both of those are basically a very airy, fluffy mix that's going to hold on to some water, but it's going to give something for the roots to move throughout and kind of hold on to. Now when it comes to coco coir or peat moss, there's really not a huge difference between the two. Yes, there might be some ethical reasons why you go with one or the other, or there may be just the fact that it's more cost effective. Some regions of the world, coco coir is going to be cheaper than peat moss, and in other regions of the world, peat moss is going to be cheaper than coco coir. So whether it's for ethical, environmental, or cost reasons, they're both going to behave about exactly the same. Now the second ingredient is what is actually kind of slightly lesser known, but you probably still see it every single time you touch a seed starting mix or a potting mix, and that's perlite. Now when it comes to perlite, perlite is often referred to as the styrofoam of seed starting mix. It's not styrofoam. Though it does behave kind of similarly, it's actually a volcanic rock that's been expanded and it crushes very easily. But what it does is it provides looseness and aeration as well as drainage to your seed starting mix. Contrary to popular belief, it does not hold on to any moisture at all. In fact, it's so lightweight and so full of air that it often floats. So when it comes to perlite, because it's so lightweight, typically people are going to aim for about 10% on the low end to about 20% on the high end of the volume of the mix being made up of perlite. So I just made this mix up, and I prefer to go about 20% perlite for my seed starting mixes and potting mixes. I find that our growing conditions and the way that we grow tends to like a higher percentage of perlite. If you find your soils drying out a little too fast, use less of it, because again, perlite really only has to do with drainage and aeration. Drainage and aeration lead to drier soil faster. So I find that I like to go a little bit higher just because the quality of my seed starting mix and my potting mix is really high. It contains a lot of that really good quality porous material. And so my soil tends to hold on to water a little longer than others do. So I tend to go higher, but that just kind of has to do with your growing conditions and your preference. But this has about 20% by volume of perlite added. And that leads us to the third ingredient that a lot of people don't really know, because if you were to just buy a bag of potting mix and throw it in this tray, you probably still wouldn't see it. And that's vermiculite. Now vermiculite is kind of like the distant cousin to perlite. They're both expanded volcanic rocks, only that the way that vermiculite is expanded is much different. It actually leads to a very porous open cell structure that actually holds on to water and nutrients within the soil. So it's much different from perlite in that perlite is lightweight and will float, does not hold on to water. It has a very closed cell structure. The surface area on vermiculite is really open, really large, allowing for a ton of moisture and nutrients to be absorbed. So they're both expanded volcanic rocks. But a lot of people don't even really know about it because you often don't see it. If you do see it, it's going to be kind of here or there. It's quite expensive in relation to perlite and peat moss. So typically, it's one of the most cheapened out ingredients in potting mixes. But the higher the quality mix, the more of it you're going to find, because what we're going to talk about in this video is if you're making it yourself, you can actually save a ton of money because you can add exactly the right amount, and because you're going to be buying it in bulk like this, you can actually save some money. Because if you were just to buy a bag of seed starting mix, chances are, more often than not, they kind of skimp out on it. Now, contrary to popular belief, you cannot omit it from your seed starting mixes and potting mixes. If you do, you're going to have a huge problem holding on to nutrients. Now, yes, peat moss and coco coir both can hold on to water pretty well, but they don't hold that well onto nutrients. And so what we're going to do is we're essentially going to add a mix to our pots or to our seed starting trays. And whenever we water, any nutrients that are found in that soil are going to flush out through leaching. What helps to bind those nutrients near the plants is actually the open porous structure of vermiculite. So this is really important to have. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of yellow seedlings. You're going to have a lot of seedlings that do tend to dry out because it also holds on to water. But you're going to find that your seedlings are going to be really lacking those beneficial nutrients because they're going to flush right through the soil. Now that begs the question, how much vermiculite is important to have? Now, like I said, in most seed starting mixes, a lot of people cheapen out when they make their mix because it tends to be the most expensive ingredient. Typically, you're gonna find less than 5% by volume vermiculite, which is shocking. But that doesn't really answer the question of how much is enough and can you add too much? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a quick little test here, and this is gonna basically show you guys the sweet spot, the Goldilocks scenario for how much vermiculite to add. In one container here, we're gonna fill them up all with equal amounts of the exact same potting mix and seed starting mix that I just prepared. Notice I'm saying seed starting mix and potting mix. Depending on how fine your mix is, you can use it for both cases. We get asked all the time, Luke, what's the biggest difference between seed starting mix and potting mix? The answer is how large the particle size is, how big the chunks are of materials within the mix. I'm using a very fine sifted mix, so there is some chunks, but there's not huge honking chunks of wood. Those are gonna be more commonly found in like a potting mix. I prefer to not have them in either, to be honest, because as they break down, they can rob nutrients from the soil as they degrade. I prefer to have a really well sifted mix for both my seed starting mix and my potting mix. That's why I'm saying both for this video. But I'm gonna be adding this mix, the same mix, into all three of these pots. And then into all three of these pots, we're gonna test the ratio. We're gonna start with a 5%, which is kind of industry standard for vermiculite. Then we're gonna go up to 15%, which I kind of find that to be my sweet spot. And then we're gonna go all the way up to 25% to show you what happens if you add too much. So how this test is gonna work, we're gonna start with a control of no vermiculite at all. What we're gonna do is we're gonna water this with the same amount of water in each case. And then what we're gonna do is we're going to let any excess water drip out, and then we're gonna weigh it. And then what we're gonna do is compare the weights of all 4 samples to really showcase the importance of vermiculite in your mix. All right, so we're gonna add this mix. The mix is dry for all the cases. Look how fast that flowed right through the soil there. Again, the soil is dry, so it's not gonna hold on to that much water right away, but this is gonna showcase the importance of vermiculite. We're gonna let it soak up whatever it can soak up, and then we'll weigh it. So we're gonna weigh this in grams to get a really accurate measurement here on the scale. We're at 196 grams for the sample with no vermiculite at all. All right, so now we're gonna add the 5% mixture, which is very standard for most bagged seed starting mixes, about 5%. Mix that up, we'll dump that into the container and add our water. All right, we're gonna add our water here, same amount as before. It runs through the pot so much slower, even with 5%. And as you can see, 199 grams. So what's happened is more water has been retained. The weight of the vermiculite's pretty nominal, but it does add to the overall bulk. But regardless, we've held more water than we did in sample 1 with no vermiculite at all. 15% going in. And you can see, huge jump. Same amount of soil per container. All we've done is change the amount of vermiculite in the mix. So yes, the vermiculite added a nominal amount of weight, maybe 2 to 5 grams or so, into the overall weight of the mix. But keeping everything consistent, this has held on to substantially more water. All right, so now final amount is the 25%. I think what we'll find through this is that this is too much, and I'll explain why. Now, because vermiculite is so porous, what's gonna happen, for some reason I feel like this is like pour over coffee for some reason. It gives me very pour over coffee vibes. But the reason why this is going to be too much vermiculite is because vermiculite is so incredibly porous. The surface area is so large that it's holding on to all that water. And you might be thinking, well, why would that water be bad? Well, that's because that water doesn't necessarily leave the soil as fast inside as it does outside. And if it's in a container, like this pot here, this pot can't breathe on all sides. So in that case, it's really gonna lock that moisture in, and you're gonna have things like algae and mold really quickly. It'll also lead to things like damping off of your seedlings, and generally, even things like fungus gnats, right? They like those damp conditions. So more often than not, too much of any good thing can be a bad thing, and this kind of showcases that. As you'll see, when we weigh this, still gotta soak a little bit more up there, give it a little more time. Each pot got about 30 seconds of soak time to reabsorb any water that it could. And then after that, we'll weigh it and see what happens. as you can see, as it would be suspected, more water. So what's happening here is the mix is staying exactly the same, but what is changing is how much water is being absorbed into the mix. No fancy editing, no studio magic. This is real time what is happening and why vermiculite can be very important to add to your mix, but it can also, if done wrong, if you're making your own mix, can be overdone. And I find that's a really big problem because oftentimes when you buy a large bag like this here, it's 8 dry quarts, right? You buy this bag and you'll just say, I'll just throw in the right amount. Maybe that's the right amount. Or maybe you might just add this whole bag and say, well, I bought it to make my own mix, I'm just gonna throw it in. If you don't like really take a lot of care to make sure you get the ratios right, vermiculite can be something that can either really help you or really hurt you if you get the ratios wrong. So when it comes to adding vermiculite to your soils, it's very obvious what the right ratio is through this test. And I, again, would fall back on 15%. And I will say you might find that 13% or 17% may be your sweet spots. And I say may because that really comes down to a very scientific base of knowing exactly how much. This is not sciencey, right? I could have had 3 more sample sizes. I could have made sure that the vermiculite was all the same coarseness and grade and weighed exactly the same. I didn't do all of that because gardening, that starts to become unfun. This is just a very quick and dirty example here using pretty basic measurements of how much is too much and how much is not enough using the 5, 15, and 25% ratios here. Now, coincidentally, I do find 15% to be my sweet spot. That works out great for me. It holds on to just enough water that it's that extra water the plants need so they don't dry out quite as fast. It also helps the compaction. You'll notice, really fascinating, no vermiculite actually compacted the most. It actually will kind of be a sponge in the soil and it won't compact as much. And so more compaction with none, and the more you add, the less compaction you have. Very cool. Compaction in soil is a bad thing. So not only are you going to get airiness, you're also going to get water holding capabilities, which is great. And the final thing to note here was in the containers that had less vermiculite, the lower you went, the more sediment and the darker the color got that was coming from the water seeping through the container. Why is that? Well, that's because there's nothing holding on to sucking up that fine particulate, which generally carries with it the nutrients. And that leads to my final example here, which is that if you want to hold nutrients in your soil, whether it's in your seed starting mix for your seed starting trays or in your containers for potting mixes and growing plants out on your patio or whatever in containers, having the nutrients in your soil is so critical, and vermiculite handles all of those areas really well. The more nutrients you can have in your soil, the better it's going to be. And so that 15% is the winner. So I hope this made sense to you guys. I hope this really helped. I wanted to touch on vermiculite because, like I said, it was the lesser known of all 3. If you are still confused about perlite or vermiculite or even coconut husk fiber and peat moss and stuff, and you want more videos, let me know. I really just think that this is the struggling point for a lot of gardeners. I see this as being the big mistake point for a lot of gardeners. So if you found this informative, if you found this enjoyable, I would highly recommend subscribing. We have lots more videos like this coming out. I'd also really appreciate it if you hit the like button and share this with someone you think would find this interesting. So as always, I hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you all learned something new. And as always, grow bigger. Bye.